The Parsha. Yeah, just the Parsha. Um, right, exactly. Yeah, right, exactly. And what papers and tests you'll be. Okay. Yes, we are Zooming and we're in person, both. Good morning. Morning. No. I think by the way, we'll probably okay, so welcome back, everybody in person. And those of you who are on Zoom, welcome back on Zoom. This is our first in person class. We were talking before since February of 2020, which is a long time ago. Um, and it reminds me of Gilbert Gottfried, the comedian who just passed away. My favorite joke of his was he said, I wonder if people in the 14th century were walking around going, this is a long time ago. Um, the We're going to do the Parsha each week. Those of you who also read the Jerusalem Post Torah column that I put out starting next week, the Parsha that we do and the Parsha in the Jerusalem Post will not match up because Israel has now jumped ahead of us by one Parsha for a few months, and then we'll be on the same page again. But right now in the diaspora, we're reading Acharei Mot, which is the 16th chapter of Leviticus. But in Israel, this Shabbat, they're reading Kedoshim, which begins in the 19th chapter of Leviticus. But I want to talk about today, I want to talk about two related subjects because today is also Yom HaShoah. And I don't think that we can speak about, especially a parsha that's called Acharei Mot, which means after death, without talking about Yom HaShoah. Let me start with what Acharei Mot is about in the beginning and what it subsequently goes on to say. Those of you who remember, not all the way back to February 2020, but 2 weeks ago, will remember that in the Parsha of Shmini, in chapter 10, okay? Chapter 10 of the book of Vayikra, of the book of Leviticus, it says, Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took a fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he had not enjoined on them. The fire came forth and consumed them, and they died. Okay? So Nadav and Avihu die in chapter 10. Then the Torah goes on, and the next two, Tazria, Mitzorah, the next two Parshiot doesn't mention their death at all. It's all about skin diseases and impurities and so on. Now all of a sudden you get to chapter 16. And it says, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they drew too close to the presence of the Lord. So the question is, why does the Torah abandon the narrative of the death of Aaron's sons for all this purity stuff and then come back to it later? One reason might be that, and this ties into the Shoah, you may know that right after the Holocaust, there was very little writing about the Holocaust. It actually took a while before people could start to express themselves about what had happened. Now has been a huge flood of Holocaust memoirs, but it took some time. And by the way, I think the same thing will be true about the pandemic. That is, it will take a while for thoughtful, good books, not just for any book, but for thoughtful, good books to come out about the pandemic and help shape how we think about it. Because the way you think about it today, however you think about it, won't be the way you'll think about it in 5 or 10 years. Because people will be able to see it as a whole and say, oh, we noticed during the pandemic, this actually changed, something that we can't see yet, whatever it is. And so part of this is just perspective. It just takes a while to understand things, and you can't, and your immediate reaction is almost never the one that you stay with if it's a significant enough event. And then the second part of this that is so interesting, to me at least, is it says, remember when Aaron's sons first die, what does Aaron do? He stays silent. It says, Vayidom Aharon. He doesn't say anything. Okay? Which is, now, here it goes on to say, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he's not to come to the shrine, and so on and so forth. And then he goes on and gives him the Yom Kippur ritual. So there are a lot of things about this that interest me. One is, who's the spokesperson in the family? It's Aaron. Remember that Moses says to God, I can't speak properly. This is all the way back in like chapter 4 or 5. And God says, don't worry, because your brother Aaron will be your spokesperson. So we have to imagine that subsequently, every time it says that Moses spoke to Pharaoh, it's probably Aaron talking to Pharaoh, because that's what God said would happen. And here explicitly, after the death of his sons, remember it says that Aaron was silent, and now it's Moses talking to Aaron instead of Aaron speaking. And what he says to him is, this is the rule for the Yom Kippur. Remember, Aaron is still high priest. And if you think about how that's supposed to comfort Aaron, the first is that it means he still has a function in the world. Because, you know, if you lose somebody that you love, you feel like, well, what am I doing? I mean, that was my whole point. Now what do I do? There's a famous Anna Freud has this in her memoir of like London right after the Blitz, of a kid in the streets who'd lost both of, I think it was a female, I think both of her parents, and she said, I'm nobody's nothing. You know, because what are you if you don't have any? So Aaron has lost his children, and there isn't really mention of Aaron's wife. So, but he has, first of all, 2 more kids. That's true. But also, Moses is saying to him, you're still the high priest. You still have this very important function. And of course, the important function is to provide repentance and therefore life for Israel. So that also, I think, is part of what is supposed to be happening here. And the parallel with Yom HaShoah is really poignant, because as you all know, there were a lot of Jews who after the Holocaust basically left Judaism. They said it's over. It's done. And some of their children found their way back to Judaism, and some of them never found out. I mean, because for every story where you find that somebody discovered all of a sudden that their parents or grandparents were Jewish, you have to assume that there were others who never discovered, you know? I mean, Madeleine Albright, yeah, she discovered it in her, 50s? But she still had a funeral with a priest, and there was nothing Jewish about it, and she was, raised Catholic and thought of herself as Catholic. And so it's not like we didn't lose people, that everybody comes back. In fact, we lost a lot of people. I still want to do 23andMe all over Spain. I'd really be curious. But the necessity of convincing people that they still have a place and a function, and a Jewish function, when they've lost, is part of the reason, I'm sure, also why you can't say the Kaddish as an individual. You need other people around you, because it's community that ties you to the tradition and also brings you back to life. One of the things that he's doing now is having a sacrifice, and most of the sacrifices, after all, were eaten by the priests. And that's the first thing you do after a funeral, is you have a Sudat HaAvara, which means a meal of transition, because you're bringing people back to the world from everything that they lost from sort of being in the twilight zone of mourning, being in a different kind of world. So that's the first part of Acharei Mot that I wanted to talk about. And then the second part of it, which is really interesting and somewhat controversial, is that Acharei Mot has all the sexual taboos of chapter 18. So we go from grief to procreation, to making more people, and how you're supposed to make more people or not make more people. And one of the things, those of you who were here earlier, and as I said, I'm going to talk more about it on Shabbat, but one of the things that he speaks about in this book about growing up in Ethiopia, from Africa to Zion and coming to Israel, is that sex and sexuality is never, ever, ever discussed in any way in Ethiopia, in the Ethiopia that he grew up in. And there are rituals. One of the rituals that he describes in the book, which I probably wouldn't say on Shabbat morning because it's not for Shabbat morning, but one of the rituals that he has in the book is after the husband and wife consummate the marriage, he wipes the blood of that he has on his penis on a rag and wraps it around some kind of cup and then carries it through the village with everybody cheering. And you can only imagine that this is probably going on literally for thousands and thousands of years. And so when we think about the world of sexuality that the Bible came out of, it's a very, very different world, because the Ethiopian community, by the way, they only had the Bible. They were cut off before the Talmud. So they don't have any post-biblical, I don't know how to make it louder. Maybe you should just move closer. It's probably, sorry. They don't have any post-biblical holidays. That's it, just the Bible. And so when he sees the life in the Bible, that's his life. There's no distance. It's like he doesn't have to project himself into a different world. Christopher just made the microphone louder. Well done. So he doesn't project himself into the biblical world at all, because that's the same world that he lives in. Yeah. They do. They do. They do. Traditionally, you have, after the wedding, you have yichud, which means aloneness. And then you have shomrim, or really edim, they're really witnesses, stand outside the room, and then you show them the bloody sheet to prove that the person is a virgin. The person here, obviously, being the woman. It's a lot harder to get evidence about the man. But this is, and you may know that, like in a ketubah, in a classical ketubah, there's a different price for a woman who's a virgin and a woman who, at least a woman who in theory is a virgin, and a woman who is known to not be a virgin, like somebody who's been married before. So the change in society, and it's one of the things that you see when you read this book. One other interesting thing, and I know I'm going back and forth, but I'm in the middle of this book, and it's so interesting, and it really does have to do, in some ways, with Yom HaShoah, because one of the reasons why Israel, first of all, why Israel exists, but even more, why Israel would go to Ethiopia and take these, very alien in terms of their civilization, people who are very alien to Israel, is because of the recognition that there were all these scattered and lost communities. But it took a while. Begin was the first prime minister that recognized Ethiopian Jews as Jews. And there was a lot of opposition from rabbis along the way. But anyway, I started to say something at the beginning about it. I don't remember now what it was. But in any case, he in Israel has 4 children, which is a lot for Israel. And his father had 4 boys. He said in Ethiopia, that was being childless. Like only 4 boys was nothing. And I listened to a podcast with him. He said, she said, if you were in Ethiopia now, what would you have? He said, 10, I'd have 10 kids. And they would all work. He said, that's what they were. Father didn't speak of them as children. They were workers. He said, and they did everything, and you did it unthinkingly, and you did it unobjectionably. He said, with my children, everything is a negotiation. Because I live in Israel, right? Everything is a negotiation. But in Ethiopia, that's what you're there for. You're there to work. Yeah. Just say them quickly and I'll repeat them. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Right. Well, that was what we talked about. The third thing at the beginning, that what the response will be, we don't know. You said that Camus' The Plague, we may expect something like that. Who knows? I don't know what kind of literature will result from this, but it will be very interesting to see. The second comment that you made was about silence being a powerful response, and that's true. We've talked about it before, but it's in the previous parsha. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but yeah, there's a lot in Aaron's response and the fact that he doesn't say anything. And third, impurity following the death of Aaron's sons is, I think, you said it's suggestive. It seems like the juxtaposition is very deliberate in the sense that whatever Aaron's sons did was clearly a violation of the ritual sacrificial impure laws, even though we're not exactly sure what it says. They gave an alien fire, but we don't know exactly what that is. Yeah, we haven't worked out. Are you going to actually bring a microphone around to everybody who? Okay, so that's how we'll work this. In the future, as anybody wants to make a comment, just wait for the microphone. And the on Yom Kippur, the juxtaposition is very deliberate. You know that on Yom Kippur, you read this section about, and it always seems so strange, like this one shouldn't lie with that one, and that one shouldn't lie with this one. But the usual explanation is that this is what people did on Yom Kippur. They would match up in the afternoon. Young people, everybody was there, and young people would match up, so it was appropriate to read this. But I think probably the real reason is because it's right after the ritual of Yom Kippur in the Torah. So it makes perfect sense that you read it and continue to read it, because that's what the Torah did. And since so much of ancient societies were ruled by these purity-impurity laws, Yom Kippur, if you get it wrong, Yom Kippur is your out. And also, it lets you know that everything that you read that says you shouldn't do this, what does that always tell you? People were doing it, right? So when it says, like, the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, of your father's wife's daughter, of your father's sister, of your mother's sister, all those incest taboos, I don't think everybody was, but people were doing it, or otherwise you wouldn't have to say don't do it. And so that's also, in a way, I have two things to say about this, which are completely contradictory. One is, and by the way, you can still send questions in via the Facebook or YouTube. We're monitoring them, although I don't see any coming up. But The two things I want to say that are opposite is the fact that this seems so strange to us shows that the taboos over time have worked to some extent. Like society has effectively said incest is bad, right? You really shouldn't do it. But also, I think that we are aware of the fact that there is much more hidden sexual violation than we knew before institutions and other things became unhidden. And I'm thinking like only as one example, but it's the most obvious example, the Catholic Church, right? People didn't know, by and large, what was going on. And once they started to know what was going on, it was far more rampant than anybody, even the critics of the church, would have guessed beforehand. So sexual violation and sexual taboo, even though we in America, we don't talk about it as if it doesn't really exist, the truth is it's a really central thing to most societies for most of human history. And the boundaries around it, which you can see now in all the arguments about gender, however you feel about it, but the boundaries around it touch something very deep in people. It's like very few people are indifferent to the arguments about gender because it touches something like core in us, values about sex and sexuality. And so it's not surprising that the Torah would talk about it and go on about it. And also, and this is part of the reason that the Torah does, sexual immorality was associated in the Torah with idolatry because the pagan societies around them did not have the same sexual taboos as they did. And so right after it says, don't have carnal relations with your neighbor's wife, okay? It says, don't allow your offspring to be offered up to Moloch. In other words, don't sacrifice your children. And you wouldn't think that those two things have any connection to each other, right? Don't have an affair with your neighbor's wife and don't put your kids to the flame in front of an idol. But in the biblical mind, those were actually very tied together because that's what the societies around them did. And they still have, Canaanite idols right outside the walls of Jerusalem. So this is not idol speculation. We can see, the Canaanite altars, rather, where you can see that they sacrifice children. That's what they were for. So the idea that this is like a wholesale rethinking of the way society is supposed to be. And the rabbis over and over again emphasize the idea that the worst thing about idolatry is the lifestyle that almost always goes with it. Because if you think about the Greek, which is probably the closest that any of us ever read to, most of us don't read like ancient Canaanite epics. But if you think about the Greeks and Homer, there's no question about morality in the way people treat each other. There's only about whether you're in favor with the gods or not in favor with the gods. And so this is a very radical rethinking of the way the world is supposed to work. Okay, let me stop there. Any questions, comments? Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Getting back to the killing or the death of Aaron's sons.
Yes.
It is a little confusing that the rituals seem to be the most important thing in the Torah because, first of all, they were killed because they were doing something against the ritual, and then immediately God asks Aaron to do this and this and this, which has to do with rituals. Is it because, if I'm understanding it well, is it because rituals are to preserve humanity or Judaism, or what is that?
So the question was, why is the ritual so important? Because they did the ritual wrong and they got killed, and then God goes back and says another ritual. I would say, first of all, they got killed not because they did the ritual wrong, but because in some way they violated God's express wish and command. That was the thing. It was less the ritual than the than the violation of God. But yes, ritual is the expression of the human way that people react to God's will. God wants you to do this, and God wants you to do it in this way, and therefore doing it is right. Our modern understanding of ritual is different, right? We do it, we say, this is how you keep the Jewish people together. This is the great shift. If you had to put, like, in a sentence, what's the difference between modern Judaism, non-literalist, non-fundamentalist Judaism, and the Judaism of, let's say, Mea Sha'arim, or the Judaism that we're reading about here? Here is the difference. The difference is they did it because God said do it. We do it for all sorts of other justifications. But if I remember, I thought about this, I've even written about it. One Friday afternoon, I was walking by Porta Via, and I saw all these Sinai members there. And I said, I had no idea that Friday afternoon was Sinai at Porta Via. And they said, oh, forget Friday afternoon, you should come here Saturday afternoon. After shul, after synagogue, everybody comes here. Now, if I had said to them, God doesn't want you to, they would not have believed it, and that wouldn't be the reason that I would give. But that would be the classical, God does not want you to violate the Shabbat and go to a restaurant on Saturday afternoon. Instead, what you would have to say as a modern rabbi is, but Shabbat is a time when you should be with your family, and you create community, and you do this, and you do that, and it's part of connection to the Jewish people, and you connect to God through it. In other words, you give justifications that are, to some extent, in the self-interest of the person. But that's not the classical idea. The classical idea is you do it because God said. And that's a really hard, I think, break. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that classically Jews didn't ever give reasons for the mitzvot. Ta'amei ha-mitzvot is a whole big area of Jewish thought, reasons for the mitzvot. But the real reason for the mitzvah was God said so. Bottom line. And that's why there were mitzvot that people didn't understand, but they did it because God said so. And the idea of, I would only do this if it makes sense to me, was to say, my sense matters more than God. We don't work that way as much anymore. And that's a huge difference in the way modernity is. So, yeah. Just a comment. Just two comments. Do I hear three? No, go ahead.
First one is, Acharei Mot is about making loss matter.
Yes, that is true.
You.
Yeah.
And secondly, my personal experience, which is still too close, is when my wife passed away.
Yeah.
I was speechless. I didn't want to talk. I had nothing to say to anybody.
Right.
So it seems to me that what Aaron did was really more natural maybe than what is being portrayed.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it doesn't say in the Torah whether it's natural or not, but I can certainly understand the feeling that it's completely natural. Because what can you say? What can you say? I mean, people say, how are you doing? And there's no answer to that. They have to ask because they don't know what else to say. But the truth is there is no way to answer, how are you doing? So, yes, I think that makes perfect sense. And then the other kind of interesting juxtaposition here is, so this parsha is called Acharei Mot, which means after death. What's the next parsha called? Kedoshim, which means holiness. So there are all these comments in among the somewhat irreverent Jewish commentators that people are always holy after they die. You know, it's like all the great leaders. People say, "Oh, I don't have any good leaders now," but Lincoln, well, Lincoln's dead, right? Washington, because he's dead. So Acharei Mot Kedoshim, after you're dead, like everybody is a tzaddik. But you can imagine, by the way, it's true. That's one of the ironies is like when you look at how the people treated Moses, okay? They obviously were not so like cowed by his greatness, because that's the way human beings function, is this idea that, you know, you worship somebody that you know well is pretty pretty rare. I suppose it happens in cults, but outside of that, it's pretty rare that you, and generally it's when people die afterwards, and then you compare them to the people that you see, because you always have problems with the people that you see. The people that aren't there anymore seem great. That's also part of a natural human tendency to miss things more when they're not there. Right? You know, it's hard to miss something that's there. Anyway, all right. So, any last questions, comments before we wrap this up?
There's some on Teams.
What's that?
There's some questions on Teams.
None of them are appearing on my screen. Yep. I don't see any questions on my screen. Oh, there. If I go down, I can see that. Could you repeat the book title, please? From Sinai to Zion. Is that it? Okay. I didn't know I had to scroll down. Okay. So From Sinai to Zion is the name of the book, and I'm going to talk about it this Shabbat. You will hear more. And with that, we're going to reinstitute the practice. Yes, Stanley.
I just wanted to ask, when you in the marriage ceremony, when you say "Ani Mekudeshet Li," does that apply to just while the bride or groom is alive, or does that imply even after they're gone?
Since you can get remarried, it only applies really while they're still alive, right? Because, yeah, I know as you'd say Achrei Mokedoshim, but no, in the marriage ceremony itself, your obligations to the other person cease at death. So you may have, now you have other kinds of obligations. You have an obligation of memory, but you don't have an obligation of fidelity. Those of you who don't know this, some do, some don't, like it is customary to say Kaddish de Rabbanan, which is literally the scholar's Kaddish, the rabbi's Kaddish, after you study Torah. And we always did that in the Torah class when it was in person, but we didn't do it online because you're supposed to have 10 people to say Kaddish. So now that we do have people, everybody please rise and we will reinstitute. Yikadav yikadash shemei Rabbah. V'yamad divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechonu v'yimachon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kariv v'yimru Hei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olmei omaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei d'kudesha le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechemata da'amiran v'yalma v'yimru Al Yisrael, v'al Rabbanan, v'al Talmidehon, v'al kol Talmidei Talmidehon, v'al kol man da'askim b'oraita, di v'atra hadain v'di b'chol atar v'atar, yehei lahon l'chon shlama rabba, china v'chista v'rachamin, v'chayin arichin u'mizona revicha, u'forkana mikodam avuhon di v'ishmael, imru, yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, Oseh shalom bimromav hu berachamav yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Thank you. Hope to see you on Shabbat. Happy to be back.
Why does this end with a nun here?